Some betrayals cut so deep they shake your faith in humanity itself. Imagine standing helpless while your own child sells you for the price of a meal, treating you like you were never worth loving at all. In a dusty frontier town, an elderly woman is auctioned off by her daughter for $20. The townsfolk watch, some ashamed, most just looking away. Then a quiet mountain man steps forward and pays the price. But he doesn't buy her to own her. He buys her to set her free. What happens next will challenge everything this town believes about right and wrong. Can one simple act of decency wake up a community that's forgotten what it means to be human? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something special waiting. The mountain peaks still held snow in their highest reaches, even as September wore thin and the aspens below began their slow turn to gold. Gideon Cross had watched that transformation from his camp at Timberline for near 3 months now, living as he preferred, alone, quiet, with only the wind and the elk for company. But supplies run low for any man, no matter how skilled at living off the land. And so he'd packed his mule and descended the long trail towards Cedar Flats, a town he'd visited twice before and found tolerable enough. He was a man of perhaps 58 years, though the mountains had a way of making a fellow look older than his count. His beard grew thick and grayed, his hands were scarred from a lifetime of hard use, and his eyes held that particular stillness that comes to men who have spent more time watching horizons than talking to people. He wore buckskin and wool, practical layers that had seen many seasons, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he could do and saw no profit in proving it to others. Cedar Flats sat in a wide valley where Sutter's Creek ran year-round, and that dependable water had drawn settlers 20 years back when the territory first opened. It wasn't a large town, maybe 300 souls if you counted the outlying farms, but it had the necessary establishments: a general store, a boarding house, a saloon, a church with a steeple that listed slightly to the north, a smithy, and a doctor's office that doubled as the dentist when needed. The sheriff kept an office next to the assayer's place, though there wasn't much gold left to assay these days. Gideon knew the rhythm of such towns. They rose on hope and mineral wealth or good grazing land, and they survived on stubbornness and community when the easy money dried up. Cedar Flats had the look of a place holding on, neither thriving nor dying, just enduring one season at a time. The buildings needed paint, the boardwalks needed boards. But the church bell still rang on Sundays, and that meant something. He'd known another town like this once, years ago. He'd had a wife there named Rebecca and a daughter named Anne, and they'd made a life in a place that looked much like Cedar Flats. That was before the fire, before the night that divided his existence into the time when he was a family man and the time after, when he was just a man alone. 15 years had passed, but grief doesn't measure itself in years. It measures itself in the weight you carry, and Gideon had learned to carry his without staggering under it. The boarding house was run by a widow named Eleanor Pritchard, a woman of strong opinions and stronger coffee. She remembered him from his previous visits and greeted him with the cautious warmth reserved for paying customers who didn't cause trouble. "Mr. Cross," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Didn't expect to see you till spring." "Winter comes early in the high country," he replied, removing his hat. "Thought I'd come down before the passes close." "Sensible. I've got a room if you need it. Same rate as before." "Appreciate it, ma'am." The room was small and clean, with a bed that didn't sag too badly and a window that looked out on the main street. Gideon set his worn leather satchel on the chair. That satchel held everything of value he owned, which wasn't much by most measures, but was everything by his, and began the process of settling in. He'd stay a week, maybe 2, resupply, and then decide whether to winter in the mountains or find work in town until spring. He'd done it both ways over the years. That evening, he took his supper in the boarding house dining room along with the other residents, a railroad surveyor passing through, a schoolteacher named Miss Hartwell who'd come west for her health, and an elderly gentleman who seemed to sleep more than wake. Mrs. Pritchard served a beef stew that stretched the meat with potatoes and carrots, and the conversation was sparse but pleasant enough. It was the schoolteacher who mentioned it first. "There's to be an auction tomorrow," Miss Hartwell said, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who disapproves but feels powerless to object. "In the town square." "What are they selling?" the surveyor asked, more from politeness than interest. Miss Hartwell hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Pritchard, who kept her eyes on her bowl. "Household goods, I expect. Tools. Some furniture." Another pause. "Other things." The way she said "other things" made Gideon look up from his stew. There was something in her tone that didn't sit right, a kind of shame wrapped in resignation. "It's a hard season," Mrs. Pritchard said quietly. "People do what they must to get through winter." "Some things aren't for selling," Miss Hartwell replied, and then she said no more about it. Gideon didn't press the matter. He'd learned long ago that every town had its customs and its secrets, and a stranger was wise to observe before forming judgments. But something about the exchange stayed with him as he retired to his room that night, something in the way both women had, looked troubled by what they wouldn't quite say aloud. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of day that promised good weather but reminded you that winter was coming regardless. Gideon had business at the general store. He needed ammunition, flour, coffee, and salt, and he went about it with his usual methodical care. The storekeeper, a thin man named Horace Bellamy, filled his order without much conversation, which suited Gideon fine. As he was settling his account, he heard the commotion beginning outside. Voices carrying on the morning air, the sound of a crowd gathering. Curiosity, or perhaps that lingering unease from the night before, drew him to the door. The town square wasn't much to speak of, just a wide spot in the street where wagons could turn around. But someone had set up a wooden platform there, and people were assembling. Gideon recognized the pattern. He'd seen auctions before, throughout the territories, and they followed a familiar rhythm. What struck him, standing there with his goods bundled under one arm, was the atmosphere. There was none of the usual energy that came with such events, no excitement over potential bargains or friendly competition among bidders. Instead, the crowd gathered with a kind of reluctant obligation, people coming because they felt they should, not because they wanted to. On the platform stood a man Gideon didn't recognize, thin and sharp-featured, with the look of someone who'd smile while short-changing you. Next to him was a woman of perhaps 45 years, hard-faced and rigid in her posture, wearing a dress that had once been fine but now showed its age. And beside her, looking small and confused, stood an elderly woman who might have been 70 years or more. The old woman wore a patched dress and a shawl that had seen better decades. Her white hair was pulled back from a face that had known considerable care in its time but now showed the weathering of hard years. What caught Gideon's attention, what made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in a long time, was the expression in her eyes. Not anger, not defiance, just a kind of bewildered hurt, as if she couldn't quite understand how she'd come to be standing on that platform. He moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. The crowd parted slightly, and he found a position where he could see and hear clearly. The sharp-featured man, the auctioneer, Gideon assumed, was speaking in a voice that carried false cheer. Now, folks, we all know times are hard, and we all know that charity, while noble, can't feed everyone through a cold winter. The Crenshaw family has found themselves in difficult circumstances, and they're looking to lighten their burden in a way that's legal and, well, practical. Gideon's eyes found the hard-faced woman. Crenshaw. The daughter, then, and the old woman would be her mother. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people looked at their boots. But no one spoke, up, and no one left, and Gideon understood with a cold, settling certainty exactly what kind of auction this was going to be. The auctioneer continued, Mrs. Martha Henley is a woman of 73 years, in fair health for her age, capable of light household work, and she comes with the clothes on her back and no other encumbrances. The bidding will start at $10. Gideon felt something break open inside him, some carefully sealed chamber where he'd locked away his capacity for righteous anger. He'd seen terrible things in his life. He'd done some terrible things himself in the war and after. But there was something about this moment, this casual cruelty dressed up in legal language, this daughter selling her own mother like a piece of used furniture, that struck him as the kind of evil that grows when good people decide that circumstances excuse anything. He looked at Martha Henley's face again, saw the tears she was trying not to shed, and he made a decision that would change both their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. His hand went to the satchel at his side, where his winter's earnings sat in a small leather purse. He'd trapped well this season. He had enough to see him through till spring if he was careful. But some things mattered more than being careful. The auctioneer was saying something about the legal niceties, how this was all proper and recorded and sanctioned by the town clerk, when Gideon's voice cut across the square, quiet but carrying. "I'll give you $20. Every head turned. The crowd parted slightly, and Gideon stepped forward, his eyes not on the auctioneer or the daughter, but on Martha Henley herself. And in that moment, in that dusty frontier town square on a cold September morning, the story truly began. The silence that followed Gideon's bid stretched long enough for him to count 3 heartbeats. Then the murmuring started, low and uncertain, rippling through the crowd like wind through winter grass. The auctioneer recovered first, his professional instincts overriding his surprise. $20? We have $20. Do I hear 25? Gideon kept his eyes on Martha. She was looking at him now, her weathered face a map of confusion and fragile hope. He wanted to tell her something in that moment, wanted to say that this wasn't what it appeared to be. But there were proprieties to observe first, legal matters to conclude before he could speak the truth he intended. A man pushed forward from the crowd, and Gideon recognized the type immediately, the kind who saw every situation as an opportunity for profit. He was perhaps 40, running to fat, with a face that suggested regular acquaintance with whiskey and too little acquaintance with honest work. This would be Earl Crenshaw, the son-in-law. 22, Earl called out, his voice carrying an edge of aggression. $22. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. This wasn't how these things usually went, apparently. Gideon could see it in their faces. This public bidding over a human being was already shameful enough, but now it was becoming a competition, and that made it somehow worse. 25, Gideon said, his voice level and final. Earl's face reddened. He turned to his wife, the hard-faced woman Gideon now knew to be Violet Crenshaw, and they exchanged heated whispers. Violet's expression was difficult to read. There was anger there, certainly, but something else beneath it. Shame, perhaps, or fear, or both. 30, Earl shouted, and now there was desperation in it. Gideon had carried $43 into town, the sum total of his summer's work. He'd planned to spend perhaps $15 on supplies and save the rest for winter provisions. But as he looked at Martha Henley standing on that platform, her thin shoulders trembling beneath her worn shawl, he understood that some calculations went beyond dollars and cents. 40, he said quietly. The crowd fell silent again. $40 was more than most men in Cedar Flats earned in a month. It was an absurd price for what was being sold, and everyone knew it, which meant everyone now understood that something else was happening here, something that went beyond the ugly economics of the transaction. Earl opened his mouth, closed it, then turned again to his wife. Violet's face had gone pale. She was shaking her head, making small negative gestures with her hands. Gideon couldn't hear their words, but he could read the argument plainly enough. Earl wanted to bid higher, wanted whatever money he could extract from this grotesque auction. Violet had reached some limit, some point beyond which even she couldn't justify continuing. "Going once," the auctioneer called, though his earlier enthusiasm had drained away. He sounded almost relieved. "Going twice." Earl spat on the ground, a gesture of disgust, and shoved his way back through the crowd. Violet remained where she was, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding something inside that wanted to break free. "Sold," the auctioneer said, "to the gentleman in buckskin for $40. The words hung in the air, official and irrevocable. Gideon reached into his satchel and withdrew his leather purse, counting out the bills and coins with steady hands. The town clerk materialized, a nervous little man with wire spectacles, carrying papers and a pen. "There are documents to sign," the clerk said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "A bill of sale, properly witnessed and recorded." Gideon accepted the pen. He read the paper before signing, forcing himself to see the ugly truth of it written in legal language. One Martha Henley, aged 73 years, transferred from Violet Crenshaw to Gideon Cross for the sum of $40, this being a lawful transaction under territorial statute. He signed his name in a clear, firm hand. The clerk blotted it, then passed the paper to Violet, who signed with shaking fingers. Two townsmen stepped forward to witness, adding their signatures with visible reluctance. The clerk handed Gideon the bill of sale. It was done. Legal. Binding. A piece of paper that said he now owned another human being. Gideon took the paper, looked at it for a long moment, then walked to the platform. The crowd parted for him. He climbed the 3 steps to where Martha stood, and up close he could see the tears on her cheeks, the way her hands gripped each other as if that was the only thing keeping her upright. "Ma'am," he said gently. Then he did something that no one in that crowd expected. He tore the bill of sale in half. Then he tore it again and again until it was nothing but scraps of paper falling like snow around their feet. "You're free," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're free to go where you please, do as you please. I bought that paper so I could destroy it. You don't belong to me, you don't belong to anyone." Martha's knees buckled. Gideon caught her, his strong arm steadying her, and she looked up at him with an expression of such pure disbelief that it nearly broke his heart. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't need to, Mom. You just need to know you're free." The crowd erupted then, not in cheers, but in a chaos of conflicting reactions. Some people were weeping, others were arguing. A few were already walking away as if distance could absolve them of what they'd witnessed. "That money's mine." Violet's voice cut through the noise, shrill and desperate. "You bought her. That makes the payment legal. That money's mine." Gideon turned to face her, still supporting Martha. "The transaction's complete, Mrs. Crenshaw. I paid what you asked. What I do with my property after purchase is my own concern." "But you can't. Violet was advancing on them now, her face contorted with rage and something that might have been panic. "She has to come back. She has nowhere else to go. She'll starve." "She'll do no such thing," a new voice interjected. Mrs. Pritchard had pushed through the crowd, her face set with determination. "She'll stay at my boarding house for as long as she needs. And before you say anything about payment, Violet Crenshaw, I'll remind you that Christian charity still means something to some of us." Sheriff Dalton appeared then, a man of 50, with gray in his mustache and a tired wisdom in his eyes. "That's enough, folks. Show's over. Everyone go on about your business." But Earl Crenshaw wasn't done. He came back through the crowd, shoving people aside, his face purple with fury. "You self-righteous son of a—" He lunged toward Gideon, fist raised. Gideon moved with a speed that surprised everyone, stepping in front of Martha and catching Earl's wrist in mid-swing. He didn't strike back, didn't need to. He simply held Earl's fist frozen in the air, his grip like iron, his eyes meeting Earl's with a calm that was somehow more frightening than anger would have. "Bean." "Don't," Gideon said softly. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't." Sheriff Dalton stepped between them, one hand on Earl's shoulder. "Earl, you take one more step and I'll lock you up for assault. Go home. Cool off." Earl wrenched his arm free from Gideon's grip, breathing hard. "This ain't over," he hissed. "You made an enemy today, Mountain Man." "I can live with that," Gideon replied. Earl stalked away, Violet hurrying after him, and the crowd began to disperse in earnest now, people breaking into small groups to discuss what they'd witnessed, their voices carrying shock and judgment and, in some cases, quiet admiration. Sheriff Dalton remained, studying Gideon with an appraising look. "That was either the bravest thing or the most foolish thing I've seen in a long time. I haven't decided which." "Does it matter?" Gideon asked. "Might," the sheriff said. "Depends on what happens next. Earl Crenshaw's a mean drunk, and he just lost $40 and his source of free labor. He's going to stew on that. I'll watch myself. See that you do." The sheriff tipped his hat to Martha. "Ma'am, you're welcome in this town, free and clear. Anyone gives you trouble, you come find me." Martha nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. When the sheriff walked away, Mrs. Pritchard took Martha's other arm. "Come along, dear. Let's get you inside and get some tea in you. You've had quite a morning." Gideon released his support, but Martha reached out and caught his hand. Her grip was weak, her fingers thin and cold, but there was strength in the gesture. "Why?" she asked, and that single word carried the weight of 73 years of living, of loving, of being betrayed. "Why did you do that for me?" Gideon thought of Rebecca and Anne, of the fire that took them, of the years he'd spent alone in the mountains trying to outrun his own guilt and grief. He thought of all the times when someone could have helped and didn't, all the small cruelties that accumulate into lives bent and broken. "Because someone should have," he said simply, "and I was here." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all the truth he could offer in that moment. Martha nodded as if she understood anyway, and then Mrs. Pritchard was leading her away toward the boarding house, the older woman leaning heavily on the younger, two figures moving slowly through the dispersing crowd. Gideon stood alone in the town square, looking at the platform where a woman had been sold like livestock, at the scraps of paper scattered on the ground around it. He'd come to Cedar Flats for supplies and peace, expecting to be gone within a week. He had a feeling now that he'd be staying considerably longer. A week after the auction, Martha was helping Mrs. Pritchard prepare breakfast when she dropped a plate. It shattered on the kitchen floor, and Martha immediately fell to her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the pieces. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her voice high and thin with panic. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for it. I'll work extra. Please don't—" Mrs. Pritchard knelt beside her, gently taking the broken pieces from Martha's trembling hands. "Martha, dear, it's just a plate. These things happen. You don't need to apologize like that." But Martha was crying now, years of conditioning impossible to shed in just 7 days. "Earl would have. When I broke things, he would—" "Earl Crenshaw isn't here," Mrs. Pritchard said firmly, pulling Martha to her feet and guiding her to a chair. "And you're not his servant anymore. You're my employee and my friend, and friends don't punish each other over accidents." Gideon, who'd been passing through for his morning coffee, witnessed the exchange. He saw in Martha's reaction the deep scars that abuse leaves, the way fear becomes reflexive, how quickly a person can be reduced to expecting only punishment and pain. Later that morning, as Martha was sweeping the front porch, a young woman approached the boarding house. She was perhaps 30, dressed in widow's black with kind eyes and a cautious manner. "Mrs. Henley?" she asked softly. Martha looked up, uncertain. "Yes. My name is Sarah Brennan. I don't know if you remember me. I used to come to your husband's smithy when I was a girl. My father had his horse shod there." Recognition dawned on Martha's face. "Little Sarah Collins. My, how you've grown." Brennan now was Brennan. "My husband died 2 years ago in a mining accident." Sarah twisted her hands together. I heard what happened at the auction, what Violet did to you. I wanted to come sooner, but I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome." "Of course you're welcome," Martha said, gesturing to the rocking chair Mrs. Pritchard had placed on the porch. "Please sit." Sarah sat, and for a moment she just looked at Martha, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry," she finally said. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner, didn't do something to help." "You couldn't have known," Martha said gently. "Violet was careful. She didn't let people see. But we should have looked harder, should have asked more questions." Sarah took a deep breath. "The truth is, Mrs. Henley, I came because I see myself in you. I'm 32 years old. I have no children, no family nearby. I work as a seamstress, but the money's scarce. I look at you and I see what might happen to me in 40 years if I'm not careful, if the world decides I'm not valuable anymore." The honesty in her words created an immediate bond. Martha reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Then we'll be careful together," Martha said. "We'll remind each other that we have value, that we matter, no matter what anyone else says." Their friendship, forged in that moment, would become one of the quiet pillars holding Martha upright in the weeks to come. That afternoon, Gideon was approached by Sheriff Dalton while working at the livery. "Got a minute?" the sheriff asked, leaning against a stall door. Gideon set down his pitchfork. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "It's more what I can do for you," Dalton said, "or what I can't do, which amounts to the same thing. I'm going to be straight with you, Cross. Earl Crenshaw's been making noise about getting lawyers involved, claiming the auction wasn't legal, that you somehow defrauded him." "The auction was witnessed and recorded," Gideon pointed out. "I know it, you know it, but Earl's desperate and desperate men make stupid decisions. I wanted to warn you to watch yourself. He's been drinking heavy and talking big about teaching you a lesson." "I appreciate the warning. There's more," Dalton said, his expression troubled. "The law around here, the territorial statutes that allowed that auction in the first place, they're relics from harder times. Times when people treated other people like commodities. But they're still law, technically speaking. What you did, tearing up that bill of sale, it was noble. But legally, it was questionable. If Earl pushes this, if he gets the right judge, things could get complicated." Gideon met the sheriff's eyes. "Are you asking me to leave town?" "No," Dalton said firmly. "I'm asking you to be prepared for things to get messy. Because what you did at that auction, it made people uncomfortable. Made them question things they'd rather not question. Some folks are grateful. Others are angry. And Earl's sitting right in the middle of that anger, stirring it up. I don't regret what I did. Didn't figure you did. Just wanted you to know what you're up against." After the sheriff left, Gideon stood in the livery stable thinking about laws and justice, about the gap between what's legal and what's right. He'd spent 15 years avoiding such complications, living alone where the only rules were natural ones. Coming down from the mountains had reminded him why he'd left civilization in the first place, but it had also reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. That evening, Reverend Michaels came to the boarding house asking to speak with Martha. He was a man of 50, with thinning hair and the slightly stooped posture of someone who carried the weight of other people's confessions. Mrs. Pritchard showed him to the parlor, where Martha sat with her mending. Gideon, reading in the corner, stood to leave, but the Reverend gestured for him to stay. "What I have to say concerns you both," Michaels said, taking a seat across from Martha. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Mrs. Henley, I owe you an apology. A profound apology." Martha looked surprised. "Reverend, I don't—" "Please let me speak. I stood in that crowd during the auction. I watched your daughter sell you like property. And I said nothing. I did nothing." His voice broke. "I'm a man of God, or I claim to be, and when I saw injustice happening right in front of me, I kept silent. I told myself it was a family matter, that it wasn't my place to interfere. But those were cowards' excuses. The room fell quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock. I've wrestled with this every day since. Michaels continued. I've asked God for forgiveness, but I can't forgive myself until I ask you. Can you forgive me for my silence when you needed someone to speak up? Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still on her mending. When she spoke, her voice was steady. Reverend, I spent 8 years in my daughter's house being treated like I was worthless. 8 years of being told in words and actions that my life didn't matter, that I was a burden, an inconvenience, something to be endured and eventually discarded. She looked up at him. In all that time, not once did I expect God to intervene. Because if God was going to help me, he'd have to work through people, and people have their own struggles, their own fears. That doesn't excuse. No, it doesn't excuse, Martha agreed. But I understand it. Fear makes cowards of us all sometimes. What matters is what we do after, whether we stay silent or find our courage. She smiled gently. You're here now. You're speaking up now. Yes, Reverend, I forgive you. Michaels bowed his head, and Gideon saw tears on the older man's cheeks. It was a powerful moment, watching someone receive grace they didn't feel they deserved. Later, after the Reverend had left, Gideon found himself alone with Martha in the parlor. She was looking at an old photograph she'd retrieved from her belongings, a daguerreotype of a young woman and a little girl, both smiling. Is that Violet? Gideon asked. Martha nodded. She was 8 years old when this was taken. So full of life, so loving. I look at this picture and I can't reconcile it with the woman who stood on that platform and sold me. What happens to people, Mr. Cross? How do they change so completely? Gideon thought about his own life, about the man he'd been before the fire and the man he'd become after. Sometimes people change because of what happens to them, sometimes because of what they let happen to themselves. Violet made choices, one after another, each one probably seeming small at the time, but they added up. Do you think she can change back? Martha asked, and there was such hope in her voice that it nearly broke Gideon's heart. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself as much as the other person. The Reverend came here seeking it, and you gave it. If Violet ever comes seeking the same, will you give it to her too? Martha looked at the photograph for a long time. Some bridges burn for a reason, she said quietly, but the smoke still stings your eyes. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the auction. Gideon was walking back from the general store, carrying supplies for Mrs. Pritchard, when Earl Crenshaw stepped out of the saloon directly into his path. Earl was drunk, not staggering drunk, but that particular kind of mean drunk where a man's inhibitions fail, but his coordination remains just functional enough to be dangerous. Behind him, 3 other men emerged from the saloon, including Jake Thorne and 2 others Gideon didn't recognize. Mountain Man, Earl said, his words slurred but his intent clear. We need to have a conversation about my property. Gideon set down his packages carefully, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. People were watching from doorways and windows, and he had no desire to give them a show. You have no property in question, Mr. Crenshaw. The auction was legal, the transaction complete, and the bill of sale destroyed. There's nothing more to discuss. That old woman was mine to sell, Earl insisted, swaying slightly. You had no right to interfere. She wasn't yours. She was her own person, and what you did was legal only in the narrowest technical sense. Morally, it was indefensible. Earl's face reddened. Don't you talk to me about morality, you self-righteous. He lunged forward, swinging wildly. Gideon sidestepped easily, letting Earl's momentum carry him past. But Jake Thorne was already moving in from the side, and Gideon had to duck under a poorly aimed punch before backing away to create distance. Enough! Sheriff Dalton's voice cracked across the street like a whip. He strode forward, hand on his revolver, his face set in hard lines. Earl Crenshaw, you're drunk and disorderly. Go home and sleep it off, or I'll lock you up." "He stole from me," Earl shouted, pointing at Gideon with an unsteady finger. "He owes me." "He owes you nothing. He paid $40 in front of witnesses. What he did with his purchase afterward is his business." Dalton stepped between Earl and Gideon. "Now get out of here before I lose my patience." For a moment, Gideon thought Earl might try to push past the sheriff. The drunk man's hands were clenched into fists, his whole body vibrating with rage and humiliation. But Jake Thorne put a hand on Earl's shoulder, muttering something in his ear, and slowly Earl backed down. "This isn't over," Earl hissed at Gideon. "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Sheriff Dalton said firmly. "It's over unless you want to spend the night in a cell. Your choice." Earl spat on the ground and stalked away, his companions following. The watching townspeople slowly dispersed, their conversations buzzing with judgment and speculation. Dalton turned to Gideon. "You all right?" "Fine. Thank you for the intervention. That's twice now I've had to step between you and Earl. I'd prefer not to make it a habit." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "But I understand why you did what you did. Most of us do, even if we're too afraid to say it out loud." Gideon picked up his packages. Fear of speaking up is what allowed that auction to happen in the first place. "I know it," Dalton said quietly. "And that's something this town is going to have to reckon with, one way or another." When Gideon returned to the boarding house, he found an unexpected visitor waiting in the parlor. Violet Crenshaw sat stiffly in one of Mrs. Pritchard's chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale and drawn. Martha was there too, standing near the doorway with an expression of wary confusion. Mrs. Pritchard hovered nearby, protective and watchful. "Mrs. Crenshaw," Gideon said carefully, "what can I do for you?" Violet's eyes flicked to him, then back to her mother. "I came to speak with my mother, privately, if that's possible." "No," Martha said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Anything you have to say, you can say in front of witnesses." The word witnesses hung in the air, heavy with implication. Violet flinched as if struck. "Mother, please, I need to talk to you about what happened, about Earl and the money and—" Her voice broke. "About everything." Martha's expression hardened. "You want to tell me that Earl forced you to sell me, that it was all his idea and you were just going along to keep the peace? Is that the story you've come to tell?" "It's not a story," Violet said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "He did force me. He said we had no choice, that we were going to lose the house, that—" "You had choices," Martha interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. "You could have asked the church for help. You could have sold your furniture, your clothes. You could have come to me and explained the situation, and together we could have found another way. Instead, you put me on a platform and sold me like livestock." Violet's composure cracked. Tears began to stream down her face. I know what I did was wrong. I've barely slept since it happened. I can't eat. I can't stop seeing the look on your face when you realized what was happening." "Good," Martha said, and the word was like a judgment. "Maybe that means you still have a conscience left somewhere inside you." "I came to ask you to come home," Violet said desperately. "To tell the town you're lying about how we treated you. Earl says if we can make this right, if we can show that you were treated well, then maybe—" "No." The word was absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. "I will not lie for you, Violet. I will not protect you from the consequences of your actions, and I will never set foot in your house again." Violet stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're my mother. How can you be so cruel?" Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I learned from the best." The words struck Violet like a physical blow. She stood there, mouth opening and closing, no response available that could counter that simple, devastating truth. "I want you to leave now," Martha said, And I don't want you to come back unless you're ready to offer a real apology. Not one that asks me to do something for you in return, but one that acknowledges what you did and takes responsibility for it." Violet's face twisted with a complicated mix of emotions: anger, shame, grief, resentment, all warring for dominance. "Earl was right about you," she said finally, her voice venomous. "You are always ungrateful, always demanding. Maybe we should have sold you years ago." The cruelty in those words seemed to shock even Violet herself. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if trying to push the words back in, but it was too late. Martha's face went very still. "Get out," she said quietly. "Get out of this house and don't come back." Violet fled, the door slamming behind her. In the silence that followed, Martha stood perfectly still for a long moment, then slowly sank into a chair. "I thought," she began, then stopped. "Part of me hoped." "I know," Gideon said gently, moving to sit near her. "You hoped there was still something worth saving." "Is that foolish?" Martha asked. "She's my daughter. No matter what she's done, she's still my daughter." "It's not foolish," Gideon said. "It's human. But Violet has to want to change. She has to be willing to look at what she's become and decide to be something different. Until then, all you can do is protect yourself and hold on to your truth." Martha nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Will it always hurt this much?" Gideon thought of Rebecca and Anne, of 15 years of grief that still caught him unaware sometimes. "The hurt changes," he said. "It doesn't go away, but it becomes something you can carry, something that doesn't consume you." Outside, night was falling over Cedar Flats, and somewhere in the darkening streets, Earl Crenshaw was nursing his rage and planning his next move. Earl Crenshaw disappeared on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the auction. Violet came to the sheriff's office in a state of panic, her usual hardness replaced by genuine fear. "He's gone," she told Sheriff Dalton, wringing her hands. "He took his horse and what little money we had left. There's a note saying he had to go take care of some business, but he wouldn't say what business or where he was going." Dalton took down the information, but his expression suggested he considered Earl's absence more of a blessing than a problem. "Men go off sometimes, Mrs. Crenshaw. He'll likely turn up when the money runs out." But Earl's disappearance took on a different meaning 2 days later, when 2 strangers rode into Cedar Flats. They came at midday, when the main street was busy with Monday commerce. Both men wore trail dust and hard expressions, and they carried themselves with the casual menace of men accustomed to violence. They tied their horses outside the saloon and went inside, where they began asking questions about Earl Crenshaw. Word reached Gideon within the hour. He was at the livery when Cooper came hurrying in, his face flushed with alarm. "There's men looking for Earl," Cooper said. "Rough types. They're saying he owes them money." Gideon set down the harness he'd been mending. "How much money?" $200, from what I heard. "Gambling debts from Denver." $200. The number lodged in Gideon's mind like a splinter. That was 5 times what Violet had gotten from selling Martha. It was the kind of debt that could make a desperate man do desperate things. He found Sheriff Dalton at the saloon, standing near the 2 strangers with a hand resting casually on his gun belt. The strangers were talking to the bartender, but their eyes kept scanning the room, cataloging faces and exits. "Sheriff," Gideon said quietly, positioning himself where he could see both men. "What's the situation?" "These gentlemen are looking for Earl Crenshaw," Dalton replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Says he owes them money from a poker game in Denver 3 months back." The taller of the 2 strangers turned to face Gideon. He was perhaps 40, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw and the kind of stillness that suggested controlled violence. "You know where Crenshaw is?" "No," Gideon said truthfully, "but his wife might." "We already talked to her," the second stranger said. He was younger, maybe 30, with cold eyes and a tied-down holster. She claims not to know where he went. We think she's lying. Mrs. Crenshaw is many things, Gideon said carefully. But I don't believe she's lying about this. Earl left without telling her where he was going. Then we'll wait, the scarred man said. And while we wait, we'll be collecting on what we're owed. Crenshaw's got property in this town, doesn't he? A house, some belongings. Sheriff Dalton straightened. You can't just take a man's property without proper legal process. We can in territories where we have understandings with the local law, the scarred man replied, and there was a weight to those words that suggested threats delivered and received. But we're reasonable men. If the wife can come up with the $200, we'll consider the debt settled and be on our way. After the strangers left to take rooms at the hotel, Dalton pulled Gideon aside. Those are Marcus Wade's men, he said quietly. Wade runs gambling operations throughout the territory, along with other less savory enterprises. If Earl owes him money, this won't end peacefully. $200, Gideon said thoughtfully. That's a lot of money for a man with none. It is, Dalton agreed. Makes you wonder why he'd... The sheriff stopped, his eyes widening as the same realization struck them both simultaneously. They found Violet at her house, packing her belongings into a trunk. When she saw Gideon and the sheriff at her door, her face went white. Mrs. Crenshaw, Dalton said, we need to ask you some questions about the auction 3 weeks ago. I've already told you everything, Violet said, but her voice was shaking. Did you know Earl owed Marcus Wade $200? Gideon asked directly. Violet's hands stilled on the dress she'd been folding. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she sank onto the edge of her bed. He told me a month before the auction, she said quietly. Said Wade's men had come to Denver looking for him, that they'd given him 60 days to pay, or they'd start breaking bones. He was terrified. So the auction, Gideon began, was his idea, Violet finished. He said we could sell Mother, that she was legally our dependent, that the territorial laws allowed it. He said we'd get maybe $20, $30, and we could tell people we needed the money for winter provisions. Sheriff Dalton leaned against the doorframe. But that's not the whole plan, is it? Violet shook her head, tears beginning to fall. Earl was going to bid on her himself. He was going to pay $15 or $20, win the bid, and then people would feel sorry for us. They'd take up a collection, the way people do when families are struggling. Earl figured we could collect another $100, maybe $150 from sympathetic townspeople. Combined with the money we'd save by not feeding Mother anymore, we'd have enough to pay Wade. The cold calculation of it took Gideon's breath away. They'd planned to auction Martha, buy her back cheaply, then profit from community sympathy while condemning her to continued servitude. But I showed up, Gideon said. You showed up, Violet confirmed, and you bid $40, which was more than Earl could counter. And then you tore up the bill of sale, which meant we couldn't even use Mother as unpaid labor anymore. The whole plan fell apart. Where's Earl now? Dalton asked. I don't know. He said he had one more scheme, one last way to get the money. He wouldn't tell me what it was, just said he'd be back in a few days with Wade's payment. Violet looked up at them with red-rimmed eyes. But it's been over a week, and those men are here, and I'm terrified they're going to take everything we have and still come looking for more. Gideon's mind was working through the implications. Does Earl have any other relatives? Anyone he might turn to for money? No, we were all he had. Violet's voice dropped to a whisper. What's going to happen to me? It was a fair question, and one Gideon didn't have an answer for. But before either he or the sheriff could respond, there was a commotion outside, shouting and the sound of horses. They rushed into the street to find a rider coming in hard from the north road, his horse lathered and blowing. The rider was a deputy from the territorial marshal's office, and he pulled up in front of the sheriff with urgent news. Sheriff Dalton, we've got a situation. Earl Crenshaw was caught trying to rob the assayer's office in Mineral Springs. He's in custody, but he's claiming he has information about illegal gambling operations in exchange for leniency. Dalton and Gideon exchanged glances. Wade's operations, Dalton said. That's what we figure, the deputy confirmed. But here's the thing. Crenshaw says he's got a ledger, documentation of Wade's entire gambling network. Names, dates, amounts owed. He's offering to turn it over in exchange for witness protection. Where'd he get a ledger like that? Gideon asked, though he already suspected the answer. He stole it from Wade's operation in Denver before he ran. That's why Wade's men are here. They're not just collecting a debt. They're trying to get that ledger back before Crenshaw can hand it over to the law. The implications unfolded like a map spreading across a table. Earl hadn't just incurred a gambling debt. He'd stolen from one of the most dangerous criminal operations in the territory. The two strangers in town weren't debt collectors. They were enforcers sent to retrieve stolen property and likely kill the man who'd taken it. And Violet, by marriage and association, was now in their crosshairs. We need to get Mrs. Crenshaw to safety, Gideon said immediately. If Wade's men realize Earl's been caught and that he's talking to the law, they'll try to use her as leverage. Dalton nodded grimly. Agreed. But where? The boarding house, Gideon said. It's the one place in town where she'll be protected by witnesses and good people. Violet, who'd been listening from her doorway, made a sound of protest. I can't go there. Mother's there. She hates me. She'll accept you because it's the right thing to do, Gideon interrupted. And because, despite everything you've done to her, she's still your mother. Within the hour, Violet Crenshaw found herself standing in the parlor of Mrs. Pritchard's boarding house, facing the woman she'd sold for $20. Martha stood by the window, her face unreadable. Mrs. Pritchard hovered nearby, protective, while Sheriff Dalton positioned himself by the door. Mother, Violet began, her voice breaking, I know I have no right to ask for your help. I know what I did was unforgivable, but Earl's in custody, and there are dangerous men looking for him, and they could hurt you, Martha finished quietly. The way you hurt me. Yes. Violet's tears were flowing freely now. I'm so sorry for everything, for all of it. I was weak and cruel, and I let Earl convince me that you were a burden instead of a person. I let him turn me into someone I don't recognize anymore. Martha was silent for a long moment. Then she said, The Reverend came to me seeking forgiveness. He'd been silent when I needed someone to speak up, but at least his silence was born of fear and uncertainty. Your actions were deliberate, calculated. You didn't just allow something bad to happen. You made it happen. I know, Violet whispered. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Will you? Martha asked, and there was steel in her voice. Or will you just spend it trying to survive, the way you've always done, making whatever compromises seem necessary in the moment? The question hung in the air, brutal in its honesty. Violet had no answer, or perhaps the answer was written too clearly on her face. You can stay here, Martha said finally. Not because I forgive you, I'm not ready for that yet, but because you're right that those men might hurt you, and I won't have that on my conscience, even if you were willing to have my suffering on yours. It was mercy without absolution, protection without reconciliation. It was, Gideon thought, perhaps the most honest thing Martha could offer. That evening, Gideon sat with Sheriff Dalton in the boarding house parlor, working through the tactical realities of their situation. Wade's men knew Earl had been captured, and it was only a matter of time before they learned about the ledger and Earl's cooperation with the territorial marshal. They'll leave town, Dalton said, studying his coffee cup. Smart money says they'll cut their losses and report back to Wade that the situation's beyond salvaging. Maybe, Gideon said, but men like that don't like loose ends. Violet's a loose end. She doesn't know anything about the ledger. She can't testify to anything Wade would care about. They don't know that. And even if they did, there's the matter of their pride. Earl stole from them, made them look like fools. They might want to send a message. Dalton set down his cup and looked at Gideon with new assessment. "You've dealt with men like this before." It wasn't a question, but Gideon answered anyway. "I was a captain in the Union Army during the war, led reconnaissance missions deep into Confederate territory. After the war, I did some contract work for the government, tracking down deserters, outlaws, men who thought the war's end meant the law didn't apply to them anymore." He paused. "I've seen what happens when violent men feel disrespected. They don't always choose the practical path. Sometimes they choose the vengeful one. So what do we do?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "We make them understand that staying in Cedar Flats would be more dangerous than leaving. We show them that this town is prepared to defend its own." "Most folks here aren't fighters," Dalton pointed out. "They don't need to be fighters. They just need to be willing to stand together." Over the next 2 days, Gideon moved quietly through Cedar Flats, having conversations with key people. He talked to Doc Patterson about organizing a watch rotation. He spoke with Reverend Michaels about the moral imperative of protecting the vulnerable. He met with the proprietors of the general store, the livery, the saloon, and the hotel. What emerged was a plan, simple but effective. The town would make it clear, through action and presence, that Violet Crenshaw was under community protection. Anyone who wanted to get to her would have to go through citizens who were watching, ready to testify, prepared to ring the church bell at the first sign of trouble. It wasn't about fighting. It was about making the fight too costly, too public, too risky for men who relied on operating in shadows. Sarah Brennan, Martha's new friend, proved instrumental in organizing the women of the town. They established a rotating schedule to keep Violet under observation, never alone, always with witnesses. Mrs. Pritchard's boarding house became a fortress of domesticity, where the simple act of women going about their daily business created an impenetrable wall of propriety. Meanwhile, Gideon retrieved something from his satchel that he hadn't touched in years. A medal from his military service, a small piece of bronze inscribed with his rank and commendation. He showed it to Sheriff Dalton one evening, explaining what it represented. "I led 40 men through impossible situations," Gideon said, "got them back alive when by all rights we should have died. I know how to assess threats, how to position people, how to make a small force look larger and more dangerous than it is." Dalton studied the medal, then looked at Gideon with new understanding. "You've been preparing for something like this your whole life." "Not preparing for it," Gideon corrected. "Running from it. I saw enough violence in the war to last 3 lifetimes. Saw what men do to each other when they believe the cause justifies the cruelty. After Rebecca and Anne died, I went to the mountains because I couldn't bear to be around people anymore. Couldn't trust myself not to see enemies everywhere." "But you came down," Dalton said. "I came down because supplies run low, and I stayed because—" Gideon paused, thinking of Martha's face when he'd torn up that bill of sale. "Because running away doesn't fix anything. It just moves the pain somewhere else." On the 3rd day after Violet's arrival at the boarding house, word came from the territorial marshal. Earl had turned over the ledger and was being moved to Denver for his own protection. Warrants were being issued for Marcus Wade and his known associates, including the 2 men currently in Cedar Flats. That changed everything. "They'll know by now," Gideon told the assembled group he'd gathered at the church: Sheriff Dalton, Reverend Michaels, Doc Patterson, Mrs. Pritchard, and several others. "Wade's organization will have people watching the marshal's office. They'll know the ledger's been handed over, that warrants are coming. The question is what they do with that information." "They run," Mrs. Pritchard said. "Wouldn't that be the smart thing?" "The smart thing, yes," Gideon agreed. "But these men have been in town for days now, drinking, asking questions, making their presence known. If they leave empty-handed, it's an admission of failure. Wade might see that as weakness. So they might try something anyway," Dalton said. "One last attempt to salvage their pride." It's what I'd expect from men in their position. Patterson cleared his throat. Mr. Cross, you keep talking about what you'd expect, what you'd do in their situation. How do you know so much about how criminal minds work? It was a fair question, and one Gideon had been avoiding. He looked around the room at these people who'd chosen to trust him, to follow his lead in protecting Violet despite their complicated feelings about her. After the war, I spent 5 years tracking men for the government, he said quietly. Deserters who'd become outlaws, Confederate guerrillas who wouldn't accept the war was over, thieves and murderers who hid in the territories where law was scarce. I learned to think like them, to anticipate them. It was good work in some ways, bringing justice to places that had none. But it was also dark work. It required me to become intimate with violence in ways that changed me. He met their eyes, one by one. When Rebecca died, part of me died with her, and when I learned that her family had abandoned her in her time of need, I wanted to track them down, wanted to make them pay for their neglect. That rage, that desire for vengeance, it frightened me. I realized I'd spent so long hunting predators that I'd started thinking like one. So I left, went to the mountains, tried to find peace. Did you? Reverend Michaels asked gently. Find peace, I mean? No, Gideon admitted. Just distance. And distance isn't the same thing. The room fell silent. Then Mrs. Pritchard spoke, her voice firm. Well, Mr. Cross, maybe it's time to stop running from what you were and start using it for something good. Those skills you learned, that darkness you've seen. Right now, we need them. Violet might be a troubled soul who's done terrible things, but she doesn't deserve to die for her husband's mistakes. There was a murmur of agreement around the room. So we do this together, Sheriff Dalton said. We protect Violet, we watch for Wade's men, and when those warrants arrive, we make the arrests clean and legal. And if they try something before the warrants arrive, Doc Patterson asked, then we respond with the force necessary to protect innocent life, Gideon said. But we do it as a community, as witnesses to each other's actions. No vigilante justice, no revenge, just protection and law. That night, Gideon sat with Martha in the boarding house parlor. Violet was upstairs in her room and Mrs. Pritchard had retired early. It was just the two of them, sitting in comfortable silence while the mantel clock ticked away the hours. She's been crying, Martha said finally. I can hear her through the floor. All night, every night since she arrived. Remorse, maybe, Gideon offered. Or fear, probably both. I don't know what to do with her, Martha confessed. Part of me wants to go to her, to comfort her the way I did when she was a child. But another part of me, the part that remembers standing on that auction block, wants to let her suffer. Both responses are valid, Gideon said. You're allowed to have complicated feelings about someone who hurt you. Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Did you ever forgive your wife's family, the ones who abandoned her? No, Gideon said honestly. I told myself I did. Told myself that holding on to anger was poisonous, that I needed to let it go. But the truth is, I just buried it. Carried it with me to the mountains and tried to pretend it wasn't there. And now I'm starting to understand that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. It's not about excusing what someone did or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing not to let their actions define your entire life. Martha nodded slowly. The Reverend said something similar when he came to apologize. He said forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. He's a wise man. But he'd also failed me in a moment of need, and he knew it. Violet. Martha's voice caught. Violet doesn't seem to understand the full weight of what she did. She's sorry she's in danger, sorry things fell apart. But I don't know if she's truly sorry for selling me. For all those years of cruelty. Maybe she'll get there, Gideon said. Maybe this crisis will force her to look at herself honestly. Or maybe she won't. Either way, that's her journey, not yours. Then what's my journey? Martha asked. Gideon thought about the question, about his own journey from soldier to husband to grieving widower to mountain hermit to whatever he was becoming now. I think your journey is figuring out how to live without bitterness, he said finally. How to be free in every sense, not just legally, but emotionally. How to build a life that isn't defined by what was done to you. Martha reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Thank you, she said softly, for seeing me as a person worth saving when everyone else had decided I wasn't. You were always worth saving, Gideon replied. I just happened to be there when you needed someone to see it. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere in the darkness, Wade's men were making their decision, leave peacefully or make one final, violent stand. By morning, everyone inside her flats would know which path they'd chosen. The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation didn't immediately scatter after the marshal and his prisoners departed. Instead, they remained in the town square, talking in small groups, processing what had just happened. Gideon was preparing to return to the boarding house when Sheriff Dalton called for attention. The lawman climbed onto the same platform where Martha had been auctioned a month earlier, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Folks, Dalton began, his voice carrying across the square, we need to talk about what happened here, not just today, but 4 weeks ago. The crowd fell quiet, uncomfortable. Some people looked at their boots, others crossed their arms defensively. We all stood, right here, and watched a woman get sold like property, Dalton continued. The law said it was legal, and maybe technically it was. But every person here knew it was wrong. We knew it, and we said nothing. We did nothing. Reverend Michael stepped forward, his face set with determination. The sheriff's right. I stood in this crowd, a man of God, and I kept my mouth shut. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in family matters, but that was cowardice dressed up as prudence. I was here too, Doc Patterson said, his voice rough with emotion. I watched Martha Henley, a woman I'd known for 30 years, stand on that platform, and I didn't speak up, didn't object. I'm ashamed of that silence. One by one, others began speaking. Mrs. Pritchard admitted her initial reluctance to help. Miss Hartwell confessed she'd been afraid of being ostracized if she objected. The owner of the general store acknowledged he'd served the Crenshaws while knowing how they treated Martha. The confession spread through the crowd like a slow wave, each person acknowledging their own failure, their own complicity in allowing cruelty to masquerade as custom. Then Gideon found himself being pulled forward, urged onto the platform by Sheriff Dalton. He stood there feeling exposed and uncomfortable, but the crowd's attention was unwavering. Mr. Cross is a stranger to our town, Dalton said. He had no ties here, no obligations, no reason to care about Martha Henley. But when he saw injustice happening, he acted. He spent every dollar he had to buy her freedom, and then he destroyed the very paper that gave him legal ownership. He showed us what courage looks like when conscience meets cruelty. I didn't do it to shame anyone, Gideon said quickly. I did it because I've seen what happens when good people turn away from suffering. I've lived with the consequences of that turning away, and I couldn't watch it happen again. The crowd was silent, absorbing his words. But what happened today, Gideon continued, the way this whole town came together to protect Violet Crenshaw, that's the real courage. Because Violet wronged you all. She sold her mother in front of you, made you witnesses to her cruelty. You had every reason to let Wade's men take her, but you chose to protect her anyway. You chose mercy over judgment, safety over revenge. That says more about this town than one auction ever could. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. There's a law on the books that says people can be sold as property. It's an old law, a bad law, but it's still law. This town can't change territorial statutes, but you can change local ordinances. You can decide that in Cedar Flats, no person will ever be auctioned again for any reason. Sheriff Dalton nodded. We could pass a town ordinance, make it official, Make it clear that whatever the territorial law allows, Cedar Flats won't allow it. I'll draft the language, Reverend Michaels offered. We can vote on it at the next town meeting. Why wait? Someone called from the crowd. It was Sarah Brennan, Martha's friend. We're all here now. Why not vote on it right here, right now? A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. Sheriff Dalton looked to the town clerk, a nervous little man who'd been standing at the edge of the crowd. Is that legal? Dalton asked. An impromptu town vote. The clerk pushed his spectacles up his nose. Well, it's irregular, but the town charter does allow for emergency measures to be voted on with a simple majority of citizens present. I suppose this qualifies. Then let's do it, Dalton said. All in favor of an ordinance prohibiting the sale or auction of any person within Cedar Flats town limits? Say aye. The response was overwhelming, a chorus of voices rising together in affirmation. Only a handful abstained, and no one voted against it. The clerk scribbled hastily in his record book, making the vote official. The ordinance passes by acclamation, he announced. Effective immediately, no person may be sold, auctioned, or transferred as property within the boundaries of Cedar Flats, Colorado Territory. Then someone, Gideon wasn't sure who started it, began gathering the pieces of Martha's torn bill of sale that still littered the platform. Others joined in, collecting every scrap of paper that represented her commodification and humiliation. They built a small fire right there in the town square, and one by one people came forward to drop the pieces into the flames. It became a ceremony, spontaneous and profound, each scrap of paper turning to ash, representing a choice to be better, to do better. Martha herself was brought from the boarding house to witness it. She stood at the front of the crowd, tears streaming down her face, as the town that had failed her now proclaimed its commitment to never fail anyone. That way again. Violet stood beside her mother, keeping a respectful distance but present nonetheless. And when Martha reached out and took her daughter's hand, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in acknowledgement that they were both part of this moment, this transformation, Gideon felt something shift in his own chest. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about choosing, again and again, to build something better on top of the ruins. The last piece of the bill of sale curled into ash and floated away on the afternoon breeze, and Cedar Flats took its first real step toward becoming the town it wanted to be, rather than the town it had been. 2 months passed, and early winter settled over Cedar Flats with the first real snow. The mountains Gideon had called home for so long were now impassable. The high passes closed until spring. He'd made his choice to stay in town for the season, working at the livery and living at the boarding house, and surprisingly, he didn't regret it. Martha had transformed in those 2 months. The frail, frightened woman who'd stood on the auction block was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more present. She'd gained weight, her cheeks had color, and she moved with a confidence that came from knowing she had value, had purpose, had people who cared whether she lived or died. She'd become indispensable to Mrs. Pritchard's boarding house, not just as help, but as a companion and friend. The two women worked together in an easy partnership, sharing the load and the conversation. Martha had even begun teaching Sarah Brennan to bake, passing on recipes she'd learned from her own mother decades ago. The town had embraced Martha fully, as if her redemption had become their redemption. People greeted her warmly on the street, asked her opinion on matters, invited her to church socials and quilting circles. She belonged in a way she hadn't belonged anywhere since Samuel died. Violet's situation was more complicated. She'd stayed in Cedar Flats after Earl was relocated, living in a small rented room above the general store and working as a laundress. The work was hard and the pay modest, but it was honest labor, and she approached it with a diligence that suggested genuine attempt at reformation. She and Martha met once a week on Sunday afternoons, sitting together in the boarding house parlor. They didn't speak much during those visits. Sometimes Martha would do her mending while Violet read aloud from the newspaper. Sometimes they just sat in silence, two women trying to figure out how to be mother and daughter again after so much damage. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps, or at least a willingness to leave the door open to the possibility of healing. On a cold December afternoon, as Gideon was preparing to head to the livery, Martha stopped him in the boarding house hallway. In her hands, she held a carefully wrapped package. "I made this for you," she said, pressing it into his hands. "For Christmas, and for everything." Gideon unwrapped it to find a shirt, hand-sewn from good wool fabric, with careful stitching and attention to detail that spoke of hours of work. The fit would be perfect. Martha had observed him well enough to know his measurements. "It's too much," Gideon said, though he was deeply touched. "It's not nearly enough," Martha replied. "You gave me my life back, Mr. Cross. A shirt is the least I can offer in return." "I didn't do it expecting anything in return." "I know. That's why I wanted to give you something." Martha smiled, and it was a smile of genuine warmth, free of the shadow of pain that had haunted her for so long. "You're a good man, Gideon Cross. Don't spend the rest of your life hiding that light in the mountains." The words stayed with him as he walked through the snowy streets to the livery. Sheriff Dalton was there, waiting for him, and the lawman's expression suggested this wasn't a social call. "Got something for you," Dalton said, holding out a badge. "Town council met last night. They want to offer you the position of deputy sheriff. Pays not much, but it comes with a house. Small place on the edge of town. Needs some work, but it's solid." Gideon stared at the badge, surprised. "I'm not a lawman." "You were a captain in the army. You've done contract work for the government tracking outlaws, and you organize this town's defense better than anyone I've seen. You're more of a lawman than most men who wear the badge." Dalton's expression softened. "Besides, I'm getting old, Gideon. I need help, and this town needs someone who'll stand up when standing up is required." "I'll need to think about it," Gideon said. "Fair enough. But don't think too long. Winter's here, and come spring, I suspect you'll be itching to get back to those mountains. If you're going to stay, best to make the decision before the wandering urge takes you again." That evening, Gideon sat in his room looking at the badge Dalton had left with him. Through his window, he could see the town square where Martha had been auctioned, where he'd torn up that bill of sale, where the town had gathered to burn the scraps and pass a new ordinance. He thought about Rebecca and Anne, about 15 years of grief and isolation. He thought about Martha's smile, Sarah Brennan's kindness, Mrs. Pritchard's fierce loyalty. He thought about how helping one person had somehow helped him more than he'd expected. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to build something instead of just surviving. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Martha, with Mrs. Pritchard and Sarah behind her. "We're having dinner," Martha said. "A real Christmas dinner, even though it's 2 weeks early. We wanted to make sure you'd join us." Gideon looked at these 3 women who'd become something like family, something like home. He thought about the badge in his pocket and the mountains in the distance and the choice that stood before him. "I'd be honored," he said. They went downstairs together, to a table set with care, to a meal prepared with love, to an evening of conversation and laughter and the simple pleasure of belonging. And as Gideon sat there, listening to Martha tell a story about her late husband's forge, watching her animated and alive and free, he understood that he'd saved more than just her life at that auction. He'd saved his own. Outside, snow continued to fall on Cedar Flats, covering the town in white, making everything look clean and new. In the town square, in the place where an old woman had once stood waiting to be sold, a new rocking chair now sat on the boarding house porch, a gift from the townspeople to Martha, a symbol of her honored place in the community. It would sit there through the winter and into the spring, through summers and falls to come. a quiet reminder that every person has value, that dignity matters, that one act of unexpected kindness can change not just a life, but an entire town's understanding of what it means to be human. And in the mountains beyond, where Gideon had spent so many years alone with his grief, the wind blew through empty camps and abandoned trails, searching for a man who was no longer running, who had finally found a reason to stay.